The moment that would define the Daniel Holtzclaw case in the public consciousness came not during the weeks of testimony, not during the presentation of evidence, and not during the closing arguments that had consumed hours of courtroom time. It came in the seconds after the jury foreman began reading the verdicts, when the former Oklahoma City police officer, who had spent his entire trial projecting an image of confident innocence, finally understood that his victims had been believed. The camera captured every moment of his transformation. The composed facade crumbling in real time, as guilty verdict after guilty verdict was announced, his face contorting from stoic attention to disbelief to utter devastation. He began to weep, then to sob, his body shaking with the force of emotions he could no longer contain. Tears streaming down a face that had shown nothing but arrogance for the preceding weeks. By the time the final count was read, he had collapsed into himself entirely. A broken man confronting the reality that the women he had terrorized, the victims he had believed would never be believed, had destroyed him with their courage and their truth. The video of his breakdown would go viral, viewed millions of times by people who saw in his tears not sympathy, but justice. The satisfying spectacle of a predator finally facing the consequences of his crimes. But behind that moment lay a story far more complex and far more disturbing. A tale of a police officer who had used his badge as a weapon, who had targeted the most vulnerable members of his community, and who had operated for years in the belief that his victims' marginalized status would protect him from accountability. This is the story of how 13 women refused to be silenced, how their voices combined to bring down a monster hiding behind a uniform, and how justice finally came for a predator who thought he was untouchable. The city of Oklahoma City sprawled across the heartland of America, a metropolitan area of over 1 million residents that contained within its boundaries the full spectrum of American life. There were affluent neighborhoods where tree-lined streets connected comfortable homes, professional districts where the machinery of commerce and government hummed with daily activity, and areas of concentrated poverty where residents struggled with the challenges that accompany economic marginalization. It was in these poorer neighborhoods, particularly those populated predominantly by Black residents, that Daniel Holtzclaw would find his hunting ground. The communities he targeted were places where trust in law enforcement was already strained by decades of tension, where residents had learned through bitter experience that calling the police could bring problems rather than solutions, where the badge that was supposed to represent protection was often associated with harassment and abuse. These were neighborhoods where a woman's complaint against an officer might not be taken seriously, where the word of a cop would almost certainly be believed over the word of a citizen with a criminal record or a history of drug use. Holtzclaw understood these dynamics intimately, and he would exploit them with predatory precision. Daniel Holtzclaw had joined the Oklahoma City Police Department in 2011, arriving with credentials that suggested a promising career in law enforcement. He was a former college football player who had briefly pursued professional aspirations before turning to police work. A physically imposing young man whose athletic background had instilled discipline and competitiveness. His early years on the force had been unremarkable, a patrol officer learning the rhythms of the job, building relationships with colleagues, and establishing himself as a capable, if not exceptional, member of the department. Nothing in his official record suggested the predator he would become, no complaints or disciplinary actions that might have warned supervisors of the danger he posed. He was, by all outward appearances, exactly what a police department wanted in a young officer: physically capable, professionally competent, and committed to the job. But beneath this surface of normalcy lurked something far darker, a willingness to exploit his authority for personal gratification that would eventually destroy lives and careers, and force an entire city to confront uncomfortable truths about the institution that was supposed to protect its citizens. The crimes that would eventually bring Holtzclaw down began sometime in late 2013 or early 2014, though the exact timeline would remain difficult to establish, given the nature of the offenses and the delayed reporting that characterized many of the cases. His method was consistent and calculated, refined through repetition into a predatory routine that maximized his power while minimizing his risk. He would conduct traffic stops or approach women on the street, in the poor, predominantly black neighborhoods of northeast Oklahoma City, using his authority as a police officer to establish control over encounters that would become increasingly sinister. He would run background checks on the women he encountered, looking for those with outstanding warrants, histories of drug use, or other vulnerabilities that he could exploit. When he found a suitable target, someone whose circumstances made her unlikely to be believed if she complained, he would use the threat of arrest to coerce compliance with his demands. The message was clear even when it was unspoken. Submit to what I want, or face the consequences that my badge gives me the power to impose. The assaults ranged in severity from forced oral sex to rape, violations that left their victims traumatized and terrified, but also convinced that reporting would be futile. Holtzclaw understood that the women he targeted faced a credibility gap that would protect him from accountability. Many had criminal records, histories of prostitution or drug offenses that defense attorneys could use to attack their character. Many were poor, lacking the resources to pursue complaints through a legal system that seemed designed to favor those with money and status. Many were black, members of a community whose relationship with law enforcement had been shaped by generations of discrimination and abuse, and all of them had been assaulted by a police officer, a figure whose word would carry institutional weight that theirs could never match. Holtzclaw was betting that these factors would combine to create an impenetrable shield, that his victims would either remain silent or be dismissed if they spoke. For a time, that bet appeared to be paying off. The first victim, whose experience would eventually contribute to Holtzclaw's prosecution, was a woman in her 50s, a grandmother whose encounter with the officer would set in motion the investigation that would bring him down. In June 2014, Holtzclaw stopped her vehicle in the early morning hours, ostensibly for a traffic violation, and subjected her to a search that quickly escalated beyond any legitimate law enforcement purpose. He touched her inappropriately, forced her to perform oral sex, and left her with the trauma that would mark all of his victims. But unlike the younger women he had targeted previously, this victim possessed something that made her willing to speak: a stable life, a supportive family, and a determination that what had happened to her should not be allowed to happen to anyone else. Within hours of the assault, she contacted the Oklahoma City Police Department to file a complaint against one of its own officers. Her report would trigger an investigation that would uncover a pattern of predation far more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. The Sex Crimes Unit of the Oklahoma City Police Department was assigned to investigate the complaint, a task that would prove both challenging and disturbing. Detective Kim Davis was among those who would lead the investigation, a seasoned professional whose experience had prepared her to handle sensitive cases, but who would nonetheless find herself shocked by what the investigation revealed. The initial complaint was specific enough to identify Holtzclaw as the suspect, his patrol records confirming that he had been in the area where the victim said the assault occurred. But investigators quickly recognized that if this victim's account was accurate, there might be others who had been assaulted but had not come forward. They began the painstaking process of examining Holtzclaw's patrol records, identifying every woman he had encountered during his shifts, and attempting to contact them to determine whether they had experienced anything inappropriate during their interactions with the officer. What investigators discovered as they worked through Holtzclaw's patrol history was a pattern that confirmed their worst suspicions. Time after time, they found women who had encountered the officer under circumstances that had no legitimate law enforcement justification. He had run background checks on women and then failed to document any contact with them, a deviation from standard procedure that suggested he was concealing his activities from oversight. He had conducted traffic stops in areas and at times that seemed inconsistent with routine patrol, positioning himself in locations where he could find isolated, vulnerable targets. And when investigators began interviewing the women whose names appeared in his records, the stories that emerged painted a picture of systematic predation that had continued unchecked for an extended period. Woman after woman described encounters that had begun as routine interactions with a police officer and had escalated into sexual assault, violations committed under color of authority by a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. The courage required for these women to come forward cannot be overstated. They were being asked to make accusations against a police officer, to challenge an institution that had the power to make their lives miserable if their claims were dismissed. Many of them had criminal records that they knew would be used against them, histories that defense attorneys would exploit to paint them as liars seeking revenge or financial gain. Many of them had been warned by Holtzclaw himself that no one would believe them, that reporting would only bring more trouble into lives that were already difficult. And many of them had internalized the message that their marginalized status made them unworthy of protection, that the system that was supposed to serve everyone was not really designed to serve them. Despite these barriers, despite the fear and shame and doubt that Holtzclaw had cultivated, they spoke. One by one, they told investigators what had happened to them, trusting that this time, perhaps, someone would listen. The investigation expanded rapidly as more victims came forward, the scope of Holtzclaw's predation becoming clearer with each new interview. The women ranged in age from teenagers to grandmothers, their common thread, not demographics but vulnerability. Each had been targeted because Holtzclaw had identified her as someone who could be exploited with minimal risk, someone whose circumstances would make her complaint easy to dismiss. The youngest victim was just 17 years old, a teenager whose encounter with Holtzclaw had left her traumatized and convinced that reporting was pointless. The oldest was the grandmother whose complaint had launched the investigation, a woman whose stability and determination had made her willing to challenge the power structure that protected her assailant. Between these extremes were women of various ages and circumstances, their stories forming a mosaic of abuse that revealed the full extent of Holtzclaw's crimes. The arrest of Daniel Holtzclaw came in August 2014, less than 2 months after the initial complaint that had triggered the investigation. He was taken into custody and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, the charges reflecting the range of offenses that victims had described. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Oklahoma City Police Department, forcing the institution to confront the reality that one of its officers had been using his badge to commit crimes rather than prevent them. The department's leadership expressed appropriate outrage, pledging full cooperation with the investigation and promising that justice would be pursued regardless of the accused's status as a fellow officer. But the arrest also triggered a more uncomfortable reckoning. Questions about how Holtzclaw had been able to operate for so long without detection, about whether the department's systems and culture had inadvertently enabled his predation, about what reforms might be necessary to prevent similar abuses in the future. Holtzclaw's response to the charges was immediate and emphatic denial. He proclaimed his innocence, characterizing the accusations as fabrications motivated by a desire for financial gain or revenge against law enforcement. His defense would be built on attacking the credibility of his accusers, emphasizing their criminal records, their drug use, their involvement in prostitution, anything that might make a jury skeptical of their claims. He seemed confident that this strategy would succeed, that his status as a police officer would carry more weight than the word of multiple women whose backgrounds made them vulnerable to character assassination. His demeanor in the months following his arrest reflected this confidence. A man who believed he would ultimately be vindicated, who saw the charges against him as an injustice rather than a reckoning. This confidence would persist through the pre-trial period, through the jury selection, and into the trial itself, where his behavior would become as much a part of the story as the evidence presented against him. The pre-trial period was consumed by legal maneuvering that would shape the contours of the trial to come. Prosecutors worked to build a case that could withstand the attacks they knew would come against their witnesses' credibility. They gathered corroborating evidence wherever possible, DNA samples and patrol records, and any documentation that might support the victims' accounts. They prepared their witnesses for the ordeal of testifying, understanding that the defense would attempt to humiliate and discredit them in ways that would be painful to endure. And they developed a strategy that emphasized the pattern of behavior, arguing that the consistency of the victims' stories, their lack of connection to each other, and the documentary evidence of Holtzclaw's activities all pointed to guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The defense, meanwhile, prepared its own strategy of aggressive cross-examination, hiring experts to challenge forensic evidence and developing narratives that might explain away the accusations as the coordinated lies of women seeking money from a civil lawsuit they expected to follow a criminal conviction. The decision to bring charges against Holtzclaw was not without controversy within the law enforcement community. Some officers rallied to his defense, viewing the accusations as attacks on one of their own, perhaps motivated by anti-police sentiment or the financial incentives that civil litigation might provide. Others recognized the credibility of the accusations and the damage that defending a predator would do to the department's reputation and its relationship with the communities it served. The divide reflected broader tensions within American policing, conflicts between the instinct to protect fellow officers and the obligation to hold them accountable when they betrayed their oath. The Oklahoma City Police Department ultimately came down on the side of accountability, supporting the prosecution and cooperating fully with investigators, a decision that would prove crucial to the outcome of the case. The 13 women whose stories formed the foundation of the prosecution represented a cross-section of the vulnerable populations that Holtzclaw had targeted. Some were mothers struggling to provide for their children in circumstances that offered few opportunities. Some were women battling addiction, their drug use making them frequent targets of law enforcement and easy prey for an officer willing to exploit their vulnerability. Some were young women whose encounters with Holtzclaw had occurred when they were still teenagers, their trauma compounded by the youth that should have protected them from such experiences. What they shared was not demographics but victimization, the common experience of having been assaulted by a man who used his badge as a weapon and their circumstances as a shield. Their decision to testify, to subject themselves to the scrutiny and attacks that they knew would come, represented an act of courage that would ultimately prove decisive in bringing their abuser to justice. As the trial date approached, the attention on the case intensified. Media coverage expanded beyond local outlets to national platforms, the story fitting into broader narratives about police misconduct and the treatment of marginalized communities. Activists who had been working on issues of police accountability saw in the case an opportunity to highlight the vulnerability of poor Black women to abuse by law enforcement, a vulnerability that had long been documented but rarely addressed. The intersection of race, gender, and class that characterized the victims' experiences added layers of complexity to a case that was already difficult, forcing observers to confront uncomfortable truths about who was protected by American institutions and who was left vulnerable to exploitation. The trial would not just determine Daniel Holtzclaw's fate, it would test whether the justice system could deliver for victims who had every reason to believe it would fail them. The selection of the jury became a critical battleground, both sides understanding that the composition of the panel would significantly influence the outcome. The defense sought jurors who might be sympathetic to law enforcement, who might be skeptical of accusers with criminal records, who might give the benefit of the doubt to a former football player and police officer over women whose lives had been marked by struggle and marginalization. The prosecution sought jurors who could evaluate the evidence fairly, who would recognize the courage required for the victims to come forward, who would understand that credibility was not determined by socioeconomic status or past mistakes. The process was lengthy and contentious, with extensive questioning designed to reveal biases that might influence deliberations. When the panel was finally seated, it represented the diverse community that the case would affect, citizens tasked with answering the question that the trial would pose. Whose word would be believed when a police officer's denials confronted the accusations of 13 women he had sworn to protect? The stage was set for a trial that would captivate a nation and conclude with one of the most dramatic courtroom moments ever captured on video. Daniel Holtzclaw maintained his confidence, convinced that his uniform and his accuser's vulnerabilities would protect him from accountability. His victims prepared to testify, steeling themselves for the attacks they knew were coming, determined to tell their stories regardless of the personal cost. The prosecution organized its evidence, building toward a case that would demonstrate a pattern of predation too consistent to be explained by coincidence or conspiracy. And the defense sharpened its strategies for discrediting witnesses whose courage in coming forward had made this moment possible. Everything that had happened since that first complaint in June 2014 had led to this trial, and everything that happened within that courtroom would determine whether justice or impunity would prevail. The trial of Daniel Holtzclaw began in November 2015, more than a year after his arrest had sent shockwaves through the Oklahoma City Police Department and the communities his victims called home. The Oklahoma County Courthouse became the setting for a legal battle that would test fundamental questions about power, credibility, and the capacity of the justice system to hold accountable those who had been entrusted with authority. The courtroom was packed from the first day, observers filling every available seat. Media representatives positioned to capture proceedings that had attracted national attention. The case had become a symbol of broader struggles, a focal point for activists concerned with police misconduct and the treatment of marginalized women, a test case for whether the justice system could deliver for victims who had every reason to doubt its fairness. The stakes extended far beyond the fate of one defendant, touching on questions about race, class, gender, and the abuse of power that resonated throughout American society. But for the 13 women whose testimony would form the core of the prosecution's case, the stakes were intensely personal. A chance to be heard, to be believed, to see the man who had violated them held accountable for his crimes. Judge Timothy Henderson presided over the proceedings with the steady hand that the case demanded, understanding that his courtroom had become a stage on which a drama of national significance would unfold. The charges against Holtzclaw were extensive, reflecting the scope of predation that the investigation had uncovered. He faced 36 counts in total, including multiple counts of rape, forcible oral sodomy, sexual battery, and other offenses spanning the period of his predatory activity. Each count represented a specific act against a specific victim, the charges accumulating into an indictment that portrayed a systematic pattern of abuse rather than isolated incidents. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Galen Giger, had organized these charges to tell a coherent story of a police officer who had used his badge as a weapon, targeting vulnerable women in the knowledge that their circumstances would make them unlikely to be believed. The defense, led by attorney Scott Adams, prepared to challenge that narrative at every turn, attacking the credibility of each accuser and arguing that the charges represented a coordinated fabrication rather than a pattern of genuine victimization. Daniel Holtzclaw's demeanor from the first day of trial reflected the confidence that had characterized his response to the charges since his arrest. He sat at the defense table in civilian clothes that emphasized his athletic build, his posture erect, his expression attentive but untroubled. He showed no signs of the anxiety that might be expected from a man facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, projecting instead an air of righteous indignation at accusations he clearly considered beneath him. He engaged with his attorneys, reviewed documents, and observed the proceedings with the detachment of someone watching a drama in which he was only peripherally involved. His confidence seemed to stem from a fundamental belief that his word would be valued more highly than that of his accusers, that his status as a police officer and former athlete would carry weight that their marginalized backgrounds could not match. This belief had enabled his crimes, the calculation that his victims' vulnerabilities made them safe targets, and it now sustained him through a trial that threatened to end his freedom forever. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the case with methodical precision, walking the jury through the pattern of predation that the evidence would reveal. Galen Giger spoke of a police officer who had betrayed his oath, who had used the authority of his badge to victimize the very citizens he was sworn to protect. He described Holtzclaw's method: the targeting of vulnerable women, the exploitation of their circumstances to coerce compliance, the confidence that his status would shield him from accountability. He previewed the testimony that the jury would hear: 13 women whose stories shared common elements despite their lack of connection to each other, whose consistent accounts of abuse pointed to a pattern that could not be explained by coincidence or conspiracy. He acknowledged that many of these women had backgrounds that the defense would attempt to exploit, criminal records, and drug histories that might seem to undermine their credibility. But he argued that these very vulnerabilities were what had made them targets, that Holtzclaw had selected his victims precisely because he believed their circumstances would prevent them from being believed. The prosecution was asking the jury to see past the surface characteristics that the defense would emphasize, to recognize the courage required for these women to come forward, and to deliver the justice that had been denied to them for too long. The defense opening struck directly at the credibility of the accusers, painting a picture of opportunistic liars seeking financial gain through false accusations. Scott Adams argued that his client was the victim of a conspiracy, that the women who had accused him had been motivated by the prospect of civil lawsuit payouts that would follow a criminal conviction. He emphasized the criminal backgrounds of many accusers, their histories of drug use and prostitution, their lack of credibility as witnesses. He suggested that the accusations had been coordinated, that the investigation had been tainted by suggestion and leading questions that had produced false memories or outright fabrications. His argument was designed to activate biases that the prosecution feared the jury might hold. Assumptions about the trustworthiness of poor black women with troubled pasts, skepticism toward claims that challenged the word of a police officer. The defense was betting that these biases would prove stronger than the evidence, that the jury would find it easier to believe that 13 women were lying than that one police officer was a serial predator. The testimony of the victims began with the woman whose complaint had launched the investigation, the grandmother whose decision to report had set everything in motion. She took the witness stand with a dignity that belied the trauma she was about to revisit. Her voice steady as she described the encounter that had brought her face to face with Daniel Holtzclaw. She recounted the early morning traffic stop, the escalation from routine interaction to invasive search, the moment when she understood that this encounter was not about law enforcement but about assault. She described what Holtzclaw had done to her, the forced oral sex that had left her traumatized and humiliated, the words he had spoken that made clear he expected her silence, and she explained why she had decided to report despite the risks. Her determination that what had happened to her should not be allowed to happen to anyone else. Her testimony was powerful precisely because of its restraint. A woman recounting the worst experience of her life with a composure that communicated both the reality of her suffering and the strength of her character. Cross-examination by the defense was aggressive, designed to undermine her credibility through any means available. Scott Adams questioned inconsistencies in her account, challenged details of her story, and attempted to suggest motives for fabrication that she repeatedly denied. He implied that she had made the complaint as retaliation for what she perceived as harassment, that she had exaggerated or invented elements of her story for attention or compensation. The witness held her ground, responding to each attack with the calm confidence of someone who knew she was telling the truth. She acknowledged minor inconsistencies in her accounts, explaining them as the natural variations of memory rather than evidence of fabrication. She rejected suggestions of ulterior motives, insisting that she had come forward because what had happened to her was wrong, and the man who had done it needed to be stopped. Her performance under cross-examination was crucial, demonstrating to the jury that she could withstand the pressure of hostile questioning without wavering in her core account. The parade of witnesses that followed each added new dimensions to the portrait of predation that the prosecution was constructing. A young mother described how Holtzclaw had pulled her over and searched her, then forced her to perform oral sex while her infant child sat in a car seat in the back of the vehicle. Her testimony was emotionally devastating, the presence of her child adding an element of depravity that went beyond even the basic horror of the assault. Another woman described being stopped while walking in her neighborhood, subjected to an invasive search, and then assaulted in the back of Holtzclaw's patrol car. She had been too afraid to report, convinced that no one would believe a black woman with a drug history over a police officer. It was only when investigators had contacted her that she had shared her experience, amazed that someone was finally asking questions and apparently willing to listen to the answers. The youngest victim was 17 years old at the time of her assault, a teenager whose encounter with Holtzclaw had occurred while she was on probation for a juvenile offense. Her testimony was particularly difficult to hear. A child describing abuse at the hands of an adult who had absolute power over her situation. Holtzclaw had used her probation status as leverage, making clear that he could cause serious problems for her if she did not comply with his demands. She had submitted because she felt she had no choice, because the consequences of resistance seemed worse than the assault itself. Her youth should have protected her, should have triggered additional scrutiny of any officer who showed inappropriate interest in a juvenile. Instead, it had made her more vulnerable, her status in the system giving Holtzclaw additional tools for coercion. Each victim who took the stand faced the same ordeal of cross-examination, the same attempts to discredit and humiliate that the defense had deployed against the first witness. Their criminal records were read into the record, their drug use detailed, their involvement in prostitution emphasized. The defense strategy was transparent, an attempt to portray these women as people whose word could not be trusted, whose accusations should be dismissed as the lies of unreliable witnesses seeking attention or money. But the strategy had a fatal flaw that became more apparent with each passing day. The women's stories were too consistent, their lack of connection too obvious, their accounts too similar in their details to be explained by conspiracy or fabrication. They had not known each other before the investigation brought them together. They had no opportunity to coordinate their stories. And yet they described the same pattern of behavior, the same escalation from traffic stop to assault, the same exploitation of their vulnerabilities by an officer who believed he was untouchable. The prosecution presented corroborating evidence that strengthened the victim's testimony and undermined the defense's claims of fabrication. DNA evidence was particularly significant. Genetic material recovered from one victim's clothing that matched Holtzclaw's profile. Physical proof that he had been in intimate contact with a woman he claimed never to have touched. This evidence was devastating to the defense narrative, scientific proof that at least one accuser was telling the truth about physical contact that Holtzclaw denied. The defense attempted to explain away the DNA as the result of innocent contact during a legitimate search. But the explanation strained credulity, requiring the jury to believe in contamination or transfer mechanisms that the prosecution's experts deemed implausible. The genetic evidence transformed the case from a pure credibility contest into something more concrete, physical proof that supported the victim's accounts. Patrol records and GPS data provided additional corroboration, documenting that Holtzclaw had been in the locations where victims said they were assaulted at the times they claimed the encounters occurred. The prosecution demonstrated that Holtzclaw's activities had deviated from normal patrol patterns in ways that were consistent with predatory behavior. He had conducted traffic stops that were not documented in official records, encounters that had no legitimate law enforcement purpose but that aligned with victims' accounts of being pulled over before assaults. He had spent time in areas of his patrol zone that had no apparent connection to police activity, but that matched the locations where victims said they had been targeted. The documentary evidence created a framework that supported the victims' testimony, demonstrating that their accounts were consistent with the physical record of Holtzclaw's activities. Daniel Holtzclaw did not testify in his own defense, a decision that was legally unremarkable but strategically significant. His attorneys apparently concluded that subjecting him to cross-examination would be too risky, that the prosecution would be able to challenge his account in ways that might damage his case more than his testimony could help it. His silence meant that the jury never heard him directly deny the charges, never had the opportunity to evaluate his credibility as they had evaluated that of his accusers. The defense relied instead on expert witnesses who challenged the forensic evidence and on the cross-examinations that had attempted to discredit each victim. It was a defensive strategy, focused on creating doubt rather than establishing an alternative narrative, betting that the jury would find it easier to disbelieve the accusers than to convict a police officer based on their testimony. The closing arguments offered each side a final opportunity to frame the evidence for the jury's deliberation. The prosecution's closing was a powerful synthesis of the testimony and evidence that had been presented over the preceding weeks. Gayland Giger reminded the jury of the consistency of the victims' accounts, the corroborating evidence that supported their testimony, and the courage they had shown in coming forward, despite every reason to believe they would not be believed. He challenged the defense narrative of conspiracy, noting the lack of connection between the accusers and the implausibility of coordinated fabrication. He spoke of the power dynamics that had enabled Holtzclaw's crimes, the vulnerability of his victims, and the authority that his badge had given him. And he asked the jury to deliver justice not just for the women who had testified, but for all the marginalized citizens whose trust in law enforcement had been betrayed by officers who abused their power. His closing was emotional but grounded in evidence, an appeal to the jury's conscience that was built on the factual foundation the prosecution had established. The defense closing was a final assault on the credibility of the accusers, a summation of every attack that had been launched during cross-examination. Scott Adams emphasized the criminal backgrounds of the witnesses, their drug use, their involvement in prostitution, their histories of dishonesty. He argued that these women could not be trusted, that their testimony was motivated by hopes of financial gain from civil lawsuits that would follow a conviction. He challenged the forensic evidence, suggesting alternative explanations for the DNA findings that would be consistent with innocence. And he reminded the jury of the burden of proof, the requirement that guilt be established beyond reasonable doubt, arguing that the prosecution had failed to meet this standard. His closing was technically proficient, hitting every point that might create uncertainty in jurors' minds, but it was ultimately asking the jury to believe that 13 women with no connection to each other had independently fabricated similar stories about the same police officer. The implausibility of this scenario hung over the defense argument like a cloud that no rhetoric could dispel. The jury retired to deliberate on the 10th of December 2015, carrying with them the weight of evidence and testimony that had consumed weeks of trial. The deliberations would prove to be extensive, reflecting the complexity of the charges and the seriousness with which the jurors approached their task. Each of the 36 counts required separate consideration, a determination of whether the evidence was sufficient to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt for that specific offense. The jurors worked through the charges methodically, evaluating the evidence related to each victim and each alleged incident. The process took approximately 45 hours spread over 4 days, a duration that suggested careful and thorough consideration rather than rushed judgment. During this period, the participants in the trial waited in the suspended animation that characterizes jury deliberations, the defendant maintaining his confident demeanor, while the victims who had testified struggled with the uncertainty of not knowing whether their courage would be rewarded with justice. The verdict came on the 10th of December 2015, the announcement drawing everyone involved back to the courtroom for the moment that would determine Daniel Holtzclaw's fate. The gallery was packed, observers understanding that they were about to witness the conclusion of a trial that had captivated the nation. The victims who had testified were present, their faces reflecting the anxiety of waiting for a judgment that would either validate their courage or seemingly confirm their fears that the system would not protect them. The media was positioned to capture every moment. Cameras focused on the defendant, whose reaction would become one of the most viewed courtroom videos in history. And Daniel Holtzclaw sat at the defense table, his posture still erect, his expression still confident, apparently still believing that his word would prevail over that of 13 women he had victimized. The reading of the verdicts began with count 1, and the word that emerged from the foreman's mouth was the word that Holtzclaw had apparently never expected to hear: guilty. The first conviction was for a sexual battery offense, a finding that the jury had believed one of his accusers over his denial. Holtzclaw's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something crossing his face before he composed himself. But the verdicts continued, count after count, and with each guilty finding, his composure eroded further. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The word repeated like a hammer blow, each repetition driving deeper into the facade of confidence he had maintained throughout the trial. Some counts came back not guilty, the jury finding insufficient evidence for conviction on those specific charges. But the guilty verdicts accumulated with devastating effect. By the time the foreman had worked through all 36 counts, Holtzclaw had been convicted of 18 charges involving 8 different victims. The conspiracy he had claimed, the coordinated fabrication he had suggested, had been rejected by a jury that had chosen to believe the women he had assaulted. The transformation that overcame Daniel Holtzclaw, as the verdicts were read, became the defining image of the case. A visual record of a predator confronting the collapse of his certainty that he would escape accountability. His face moved through stages of disbelief, his composure crumbling in real time as the guilty verdicts accumulated. His eyes reddened, then filled with tears that began to stream down his face. His jaw trembled, his breathing became ragged, his body began to shake with the force of emotions he could no longer suppress. By the time the final verdict was read, he had collapsed into open sobbing, his head bowed, his shoulders heaving, the arrogant confidence that had characterized his demeanor throughout the trial utterly destroyed. The camera captured every moment, creating a video that would be viewed millions of times by people who saw in his tears not sympathy, but satisfaction. This was justice made visible. A predator, finally understanding that his victims had been believed, that his badge had not protected him, that the consequences he had thought he could evade had finally caught up with him. The sentencing hearing that followed the guilty verdicts was an opportunity for the victims to speak directly about the impact of Holtzclaw's crimes on their lives. One by one, the women he had assaulted addressed the court, describing the trauma that had followed their encounters with a police officer who had betrayed his oath. They spoke of the fear that had dominated their lives since the assaults, the inability to trust law enforcement, the psychological wounds that had proved far more lasting than any physical injuries. They described the courage it had taken to come forward, the terror of confronting a system that had every reason to protect their abuser over them. And they expressed the relief that the guilty verdicts had brought, the validation of their experiences after so many had doubted them, the sense that justice, however delayed, had finally been achieved. Their statements were powerful testimony to the human cost of Holtzclaw's crimes, the rippling effects of trauma that extended far beyond the moments of assault themselves. The prosecution asked for consecutive sentences on each count, arguing that the severity of the crimes and the number of victims warranted punishment that would ensure Holtzclaw never again posed a threat to the community. Gayland Giger reminded the court of the pattern of predation that the trial had revealed. The systematic targeting of vulnerable women by an officer who had used his authority as a weapon. He argued that Holtzclaw represented exactly the kind of danger that maximum sentences were designed to address. A predator who had shown no remorse and who would likely reoffend if ever given the opportunity. The defense asked for concurrent sentences and leniency, arguing that their client's lack of prior criminal record and the disputed nature of the evidence warranted a less severe punishment. Scott Adams suggested that the convictions themselves were sufficient punishment for a former police officer who would face particular difficulties in prison, that additional decades of incarceration would serve no purpose beyond vengeance. Judge Timothy Henderson's sentencing decision reflected the gravity with which the court viewed Holtzclaw's crimes. He noted the abuse of authority that the convictions represented, the betrayal of public trust by an officer who had used his badge to victimize rather than protect. He acknowledged the courage of the victims who had come forward, whose testimony had made the convictions possible despite every obstacle the system had placed in their path. And he imposed a sentence that ensured Daniel Holtzclaw would never again be free to harm anyone. 263 years in prison. The sentence was structured as consecutive terms for each conviction, the years stacking upon each other until they exceeded any possible human lifespan. Holtzclaw would die in prison, his freedom permanently revoked, his crimes punished with the most severe sentence the court could impose. The number became another defining element of the case, a numerical representation of justice that was as striking in its way as the video of his breakdown during the verdict reading. The aftermath of the Holtzclaw case extended far beyond the defendant himself, touching on issues of police accountability, the treatment of marginalized victims, and the capacity of the justice system to deliver justice when power structures favored the accused. The convictions were celebrated by activists who had long argued that police misconduct too often went unpunished, that the word of officers was given undue weight over the testimony of their victims. The case became a reference point in discussions of how to reform law enforcement, how to ensure that the badges given to officers were not used as weapons against the communities they were supposed to serve. Training programs were revised, oversight mechanisms were examined, and uncomfortable conversations were held about the vulnerabilities that Holtzclaw had exploited, and that might be exploited by other predators hiding behind uniforms. The victims who had testified became advocates in their own right, their courage in coming forward inspiring others who had been silenced by the same dynamics that Holtzclaw had exploited. They spoke publicly about their experiences, about the importance of believing survivors regardless of their backgrounds, about the systemic changes that were needed to protect vulnerable women from predators in positions of authority. Their visibility challenged stereotypes about who could be a credible victim, demonstrating that criminal records and drug histories did not disqualify women from deserving protection and justice. They transformed their trauma into advocacy, their individual suffering into collective action that might prevent others from experiencing what they had endured. Daniel Holtzclaw was transferred to a prison facility where he would begin serving his 263-year sentence. His law enforcement career and his freedom permanently ended. He continued to maintain his innocence, filing appeals that challenged the convictions on various grounds. His supporters, a small but vocal group that included some law enforcement officers and commentators who questioned the credibility of his accusers, argued that he had been the victim of a rush to judgment, that the verdicts reflected political pressure rather than genuine evidence of guilt. These claims found little traction in the legal system, with appeals courts rejecting challenges to the convictions and affirming the sentence that had been imposed. The evidence that had convinced a jury continued to support the verdict through appellate review. The consistency of the victims' accounts and the corroborating physical evidence proving as persuasive to judges as they had been to the jury that delivered the original verdict. The video of Holtzclaw's breakdown during the verdict reading achieved a cultural significance that extended beyond the specific facts of his case. It became a symbol of justice achieved against the odds, a visual representation of accountability that was shared and discussed and analyzed across social media platforms. Viewers found satisfaction in watching the arrogance drain from his face, the confidence that had characterized his demeanor replaced by the despair of a man finally understanding that his victims had been believed. The video was viewed millions of times, becoming one of the most watched courtroom moments in the age of viral content. It served as evidence that the justice system could, sometimes, deliver for victims who had every reason to doubt it, that power and authority did not always protect those who abused them. The Oklahoma City Police Department faced its own reckoning in the aftermath of the case. Questions about how Holtzclaw had been able to operate for so long without detection, forcing examination of practices and culture that might have enabled his predation. Reforms were implemented, oversight was strengthened, and difficult conversations were held about the vulnerabilities that existed within the department's systems. The case became a teaching moment for law enforcement agencies across the country, an example of what could go wrong when officers were given authority without adequate accountability. Training programs incorporated lessons from the Holtzclaw case, emphasizing the importance of taking all complaints seriously regardless of the complainant's background, of recognizing that predators could hide behind badges as easily as they could hide anywhere else. For the 13 women whose courage had made the convictions possible, the aftermath of the trial was a mixture of vindication and ongoing struggle. The guilty verdicts had validated their experiences, had demonstrated that the system could believe them, despite every reason it had not to. But the trauma of their assaults and the ordeal of testifying did not disappear with the verdict. Many continued to struggle with the psychological effects of what they had endured, the violation of trust that came from being assaulted by someone who was supposed to protect them. Some found healing in advocacy, in using their experiences to push for changes that might protect others. Others retreated from public attention, seeking to rebuild their lives away from the spotlight that the case had brought. Their paths diverged, but they shared the bond of having stood together against a system that had every reason to doubt them, and having prevailed. The legacy of the Daniel Holtzclaw case continues to resonate in discussions of police accountability, victim credibility, and the intersection of race, gender, and power in the American justice system. The convictions demonstrated that marginalized victims could be believed, that the credibility gap that had protected predators like Holtzclaw was not insurmountable. The sentence demonstrated that severe punishment was possible for officers who betrayed their oaths, that the badge was not a license for abuse, and the video of his breakdown became an enduring symbol of justice achieved, a reminder that even those who believe themselves untouchable can be brought down by the courage of their victims and the determination of a system that sometimes works as it should. In his prison cell, Daniel Holtzclaw continues to serve a sentence that will outlast any possible lifespan, his days reduced to the routines of incarceration that will define the remainder of his existence. He maintains his innocence, continues to pursue appeals, and apparently still believes that he was the victim of a conspiracy rather than the perpetrator of systematic abuse. Whether he will ever accept responsibility for what he did, ever acknowledge the harm he caused to 13 women whose lives intersected with his in the worst possible way, remains unknown. But his acceptance or denial is ultimately irrelevant. The justice system rendered its verdict, imposed its sentence, and closed the chapter on his predatory career. The women he assaulted have moved forward with their lives, carrying scars that may never fully heal, but also carrying the knowledge that they were believed. And the video of his breakdown remains, a permanent record of the moment when a predator finally understood that his victims had destroyed him with the only weapons they possessed: their voices and their truth.